research agenda, and with the studies at the graduate level, master and PhD degrees, we're developing on knowledge governance. Although Werner is much more concerned with this idea of value networks that she will give us in this talk. And it will be extremely important for us and for our guests here that come from the Society of Knowledge Management, Knowledge Management. So I would like her to present herself in a more detail, because this will really be an opportunity and also a pleasure. And I'll immediately pass the microphone to her.
Thank you. It is a real pleasure to be here with this particular kind of audience, because it allows me to talk about what I believe is some of the most exciting work that we do, but it's the kind of work that most of our business customers aren't so interested in. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about ValueNetworks.com. This is a technology startup company, and we have taken the value network analysis methodology and created applications to support it. Now, most of our customers are large global corporations. We work with companies like Boeing and Cisco, Alcatel-Lucent, Oracle, large technology companies. We work with healthcare networks, people who are dealing with complexity in very complex organizations, literally hundreds of thousands of relationships, both with employees and customers, that they must manage. So some of the stories I have to tell are from companies, but and what we've been able to do there is show people the predictive capability of network patterns. And I'll go into that a bit more. But another area that is of profound interest to us, both as a company and certainly to me personally, are innovation networks and economic development. And so I play a bit of a research role in some projects with the European Commission, regional development agencies, and we have uncovered some very exciting ways, we believe, to think about economic development in a way that incorporates both financial and intellectual capital. So that's what I'm going to share with you today, is that work. I was in Gramado at the KM conference, and all of my examples were from business, so it's not that that isn't an aspect. I'm one of these people that has a foot in both worlds. I am not an academic, but I have a very strong bent towards research and methodologies. But I decided many years ago that rather than working in a university, that I would do all of my lab work in business, really applying the ideas. So rather than being a professor, I chose to be a business consultant and actually try out things. And I only wrote the theory article on value networks 2 years ago in the Journal of Intellectual Capital. It was an award-winning article, and I do get cited rather frequently in academic journals because I have over 50 articles out there. But I don't publish until I know it works. So it's a combination of theory and practice. So let me share with you what this work is about. I still love this quote, and I think I had this when I was here in 1998, that my last time in Brazil was when Vanya organized the very first KM conference in Brazil here in Rio. And it was a very exciting event, and she set the bar very high for Brazilian hospitality as well. We had a wonderful time at that conference and have stayed in touch since, and it's a thrill to reconnect with her. And because I was reflecting back on that, I went back to some of those presentations I did in 1998 and came across this slide that was one of my favorites at the time, with the quote from Winston Churchill saying, "The empires of the future will be empires of the mind." And I believe we are fully beginning to realize that prediction with the knowledge economy. What's happening is the new technologies are supporting entrepreneurism, and development and innovation strategies are at a turning point. Certainly we've seen business at the same turning point, very different ways of creating companies, of working. Virtually any company can be a global company, which is amazing. When I was growing up, to even travel or know anyone in another country was an amazing thing. And now people can sit in any part of the world and have customers from any other part of the world and create and maintain slightly, at least, those friendships. So what does this mean in terms of development? Well, the traditional development methods actually don't adequately address the intangible assets and relationships and interactions, which should represent up to 80% or more of business value. Even after the 2008 crash, one of the intellectual capital journals said that intangibles represent 50 to 70% of a company value, and they really, I don't know what the latest figures are on country value or if we have them, but I would guess it's very comparable. And yet we don't adequately address that in our development strategies. So we miss emerging opportunities, we miss some of the trends for how businesses need to execute. We create policies based on past practices or current practices instead of really being able to understand what is emerging, and perhaps those policies we're creating actually get in the way. And then we need to manage that. And the challenges of what kind of support and infrastructure is needed, and as well as what do we track, what do we monitor, particularly in intra and inter-regional development. So the classic model of intangibles, the intellectual capital world came up with a basic set of categories around human competence, the ways that people work together as in the internal structure, not in technology systems, but in human work patterns, business relationships, and the networks that support your business. And of course, in any group of people who are meeting for a purpose, your sense of identity, your purpose, your reputation, what you stand for is certainly an intangible asset. We've all seen how reputation can literally destroy even huge companies overnight. So reputation is a critical intangible asset, reputation, brand, and of course, at the same time that model of intellectual capital was emerging in companies, triple bottom line and other kinds of intangible models were coming forward having to do with social citizenship and environmental health. So in that context, we do need to pay attention to the tangible impact and the financial aspects, but the intangible impacts and indicators are the leading indicators. By the time you get to a financial picture, it tells you about the present or the past, but if you want to understand the future and how you're building strategic capability, those leading indicators are all on the intangible side. So the idea of intangibles began to move into a national and regional perspective in the late 1990s with the work of people like Leif Edmondson and Pulik and others. And there's also been an increasing systems perspective that is emerging around all the different influences. Another important concept in development, of course, has been the industry cluster concept promoted by Michael Porter and many other people. Lots of good work going on in there. Regional innovation systems concept is perhaps a bit closer to the idea of a complex adaptive system or network. So there's been a lot of good work that has already come together around the really big question of how to link innovation to economic and intellectual capital outcomes. So if people naturally network to create value, which is a pretty safe assumption, as well as been demonstrated over years of research, why not model value creation as a network? People network to create value, but we haven't modeled our economics as networks. The unit of analysis has traditionally been the company, the industry or a cluster, the region, perhaps from an economic perspective, or the nation state. We have only recently begun to look at networks as producers of social and economic good. Mark Granovetter of Stanford put together, I don't know, it was about 4 years ago now, he edited a book on socioeconomics, which was the best of the thinking and writing and research on understanding the economic dynamics of networks. That collection of articles was pitiful. I was appalled. I thought, surely there is better work than this. Now, as I said, I'm not a researcher, so I haven't kept up on things, and undoubtedly several of you are thinking, oh, you should know about this and you should know about that. So I haven't been scanning deeply in this area, but it is very, very new for us to think about networks as the engine of economic and social development. So we address this head-on with value network analysis. And as far as I know, it is the only network approach designed to consider both intangibles and intangible, both tangible and intangible value, both formal business interactions and human interactions as one network model. So I'm going to walk you through how this happens. Network patterns are everywhere. This pattern here, the large one, is a network pattern of the internet. This is not a terribly bright picture, but there's also a pattern on the left. Anyone know what this pattern might be, or a guess? This is actually the pattern of life itself. This is the DNA network. DNA. Now, yes, you're laughing because you've seen all of those illustrations, as I have for the last 20 years, of DNA as one lonely strand of DNA floating in space all by itself. The orange coming out here is actually, you can actually see a little bit of the double helix pattern, but without the network connections, it's useless. Humans work as networks. We always have. And we have worked as networks internally, inside our organizations. We work as networks across organizations. It is our natural way to connect and create outcomes. And when you think of it, it's, if you have an emergency, when the river is flooding, people run down to the river. They don't sit down and draw a process flow chart or an organization chart, do they? No. What they do is say, sign up and say, I'll move traffic, I'll be a traffic controller. Someone else says, I'll be a food provider, you guys are going to get hungry. Someone else says, I'll be a bag holder, I'll hold the sandbags. Somebody else says, I'll be a shoveler. They network, they negotiate how they're going to interact in those roles, and they get it done. It is a very natural way for us to organize, so natural that we've managed to ignore it. Right? Just ignore it. We're the fish in the ocean. We don't even see what we're doing. So can we make those networks visible? Now, social network analysis, I'm assuming most people here are familiar with social network analysis, right? It's very, very useful in economic and industry analysis. This is a pair of pictures done by one of our value network practitioners in Australia. He was using social network analysis to look at the pattern of media industry relationships in 2000, 2001, and then 5 years later, 2005, 2006. And the data for this was simply collected from looking at what companies were partnering on projects, publicly available information, and he just put together, who's working on joint projects. In year 2000, in the world of media, the big, what we call the 500-pound gorilla, was Microsoft, here in the middle. And way over here, about 9 o'clock, is a little tiny influencer called Google. Clear warning, I'm very clumsy. I undoubtedly will do a cartwheel somewhere. So 5 years later, Microsoft is still a very important player, and Google is right here. So network analysis is very powerful for helping us to see patterns of change. Social network analysis is very useful for tracking influence and position in industries, and has a lot of other good uses in social and economic development as well. But there are also some limitations in really being able to deeply understand these relationships. In social network analysis, nodes typically represent either individual people or individual institutions, is the way that we've looked at them before. So there is one link. It can be a directional link, but there is one link in a social, one kind of link in a social network, and only one link is allowed between the nodes. So it's a rather limited view. It means all of these people have joint projects, right? Or you could do your Twitter network, right? So these are all the people I'm connected to on Twitter or Facebook, and who's connected to them. And it's very straightforward. In fact, I firmly believe that social network visuals of individual connections will be standard on things like Facebook and collaboration platforms within 18 months, 2 years maximum. It's not a terribly difficult technology to implement behind any application that shows connections. And I believe that people will be using them quite frequently. The good thing about that is that there is a societal level learning to read network patterns. You see them everywhere. They're used as illustrations. Our literacy of being able to read network patterns is rising as a whole society. I think that is a significant trend. Why? We, in most of our analysis and business modeling tools, are beautifully designed for left brain intelligence. Spreadsheets, flowcharts, mathematical analysis, statistical analysis. What we have neglected is the very human, incredible talent to see patterns. Your capacity to see and sense patterns is what allows you to drive down the street while you're talking to your friend in the front seat, planning where what you need to pick up on the way home for dinner, and all of that multitasking. Why are there not more accidents? This is phenomenal, the way that we can read patterns and anticipate change by simple little changes in the pattern. You see the people, the cars swerving, and you go, oh my gosh, that was close. The miracle isn't that there are accidents. The miracle is that there are so few. This pattern intelligence is something that we have completely neglected in our analytics. I think of it as holding up the mirror to a network so that that network can see itself. This pattern intelligence is something you could, as an analyst, you could never figure out completely what is happening in a complex network. People who participate in that network, who have the embodied knowledge of how that network evolved over time, who those people really are, they can look at that pattern and instantly say, oh, there's a problem. Your analytics might say you might want to look in this part of the network or at this role or whatever to see if there might be a problem, but it's the human intelligence that we need to tap. So how can we do that? The value network modeling allows you to identify the specific kind of value that is being created in those connections. It can demonstrate how efficiently your local or regional value networks are converting resources, their inputs, to value outputs. It can show you the value creation failure points, problems in the flow paths, problems in the roles, and it can help you understand how those relationships really work. A definition for people who like definitions, we define value networks as sets of roles, interactions, and relationships generating economic, social, or environmental value, or all three. Any purposeful group of people or institutions can be understood as a value network. And that is just as true whether it's 5 people on a work team, whether it's a cross-boundary work team of 20 people, a large-scale business activity that cuts across the organization, regional networks, business alliances, global activist networks. We've worked with groups looking at international peacemaking, for example, Global Reporting Initiative. But this is a way of understanding purposeful groups, not just social networks. A social network collectively has no shared purpose. It has shared interests, shared values, but people participate in a social network for their own purpose and of the value that they gain. I'm talking about groups of people that are trying to work together or share an objective to improve education. What does that network look like? How can we help it work more effectively? Many institutions involved, many individuals involved. So it's a method. It is a methodology. I first developed this method back in my own re-engineering days to handle data from benchmarking best practices interviews. And in 1997, in work with Don Tapscott's group, I incorporated knowledge flows and intangibles and intellectual asset management in the methodology. And I've been testing and validating it in work with companies and organizations ever since. So here's the theory. Only 2 slides for those of you who hate theory. People create value. How do they do that? We all have assets at our disposal. We have, as individuals, as companies, as organizations, as regions, we have some financial assets. We have some competence, some basic knowledge. We have relationships, reputation, brand. So we have a kind of a social, some people think of this as social capital. And we have some what we call internal structure in the Carlac-Sveby model, which is about the ways that we work together, not the technologies that support us. That's over here in financial assets and hard assets, but the ways that we work together. So we have some things we know how to do, and we've got some good ways to work on that. What we do is we convert our assets into negotiable forms of value so that we can gain more value. How does that work? We utilize those assets through the roles we play, through our professional roles. I'm going to create value as a teacher. I'm going to create value as a technology developer. So we choose a role that we can execute well in the world. We convert those assets into other kinds of value deliverables. It could be a pair of pants. It could be a report. Doesn't matter. But we say, oh, I can turn what I know how to do into this. We offer it into the market as a transaction, and we receive value in return. And value here is in the large sense. It could be a financial value. You might charge money for that deliverable. You might use a deliverable to negotiate another intangible. So maybe I'll share my business contacts and network in Asia with your company if you support us on this policy position, right? So we negotiate on knowledge and intangibles all the time anyway. So it doesn't matter whether it's financial or non-financial. We take that as an input. Okay, I've got it now. And what do? We realize value for ourselves. It either gives us a gain in our financial picture, we've improved our competence, we've built some social capital, we've learned how to work in a new way or work better, and this is a continuous cycle. I call this the value conversion picture, and I published this in the Journal of Intellectual Capital in January 2008. Now, the thing about this is everybody else is doing the same thing, right? Everybody you come in contact with, every organization you come in contact with is doing exactly the same thing. So if you look at the entities, which we typically call roles, and unpack all of these interactions, you have a value network. But find deliverables, they're not just, oh, these people are connected. We go even further. So in modeling the value network, the nodes represent roles. The arrows, and we do use directional arrows, have a very specific label on them. It's a tangible deliverable. It is a request for proposal. It's a contract. It has something to do with the money. These are the kinds of contractual things that are often regulated. They are the kinds of things, if you don't do these, somebody wants their money back. Formal, structured. Intangible deliverables are all of the informal ways that we support each other. I'll provide some research tips to you. It's not a contract, but that continual exchange of research tips and maybe what we negotiate is you'll let me know when there's funding opportunities for projects. That's not contractual. It's not formal. It's not structured. Is it important for our success? You bet it is. And if it's that important, then why not make it visible and transparent so that we can negotiate on those intangibles, so that we can really understand how a group of people or a group of institutions or roles creates value. So your tangible deliverables are goods, services, and revenue, anything having to do with the traditional value chain, contractual, government. It's what's mandated. This is what the things that you are obligated to do for the funding that you receive as an agency. Anything having to do with contracts or informal structure. Intangibles are all of the knowledge and support offerings, exchanges of strategic information, collaborative design, plans, processes, policy development, and so forth. And benefits and ways that we support each other by exchanging business contacts, image enhancement. People often will participate in associations because it gives them a certain level of prestige. These are all motivators that are important to understand if you're trying to understand how is value really created. What motivates people to engage? These are just as important. So let's take an example. This is from some work that we did with Ag Research in New Zealand. Ag Research commercializes scientific discoveries. Very interesting. They actually are a government agency, but they work very closely with commercializers to commercialize scientific discoveries. Things like designer milk. Designer milk. What they do is they genetically engineer a cow to produce certain enzymes in their milk that treat medical conditions. They call it designer milk. Fun bunch of people. Ag Research plays an investor role. They invest in the scientific research. They have a key role as researcher and to a point as a developer of these discoveries. They need to interact with commercializers, investors, science funders, and market participants in order to bring products to market. In this view, you only have the tangible deliverables, intellectual property rights, contracts, proposals, research outcomes, terms of reference, all of the things that you would track as a formal process of bringing an innovation to market. The challenge for them is it could take 12 years to get one of these discoveries to market. That is a very long time. So they wanted to accelerate this. And so instead of looking at it as a linear way, we looked at it as a value network. And the key was the intangible interactions that built the relationships and kept the tangible flows moving. Things like sharing strategic capability, referrals, new opportunities, a validation of the work that you're doing, feedback on how it's going, market feedback, informal expertise to the commercializers. Here's that exchange of ideas. Now, the interesting thing about intangibles, when you think of them as deliverables, you can manage them just as deliberately as you manage anything else. Where does it start? It starts with the question you're trying to address. And it really doesn't matter. This is what we're mapping here is the ecosystem. You could take a specific project and trace the path of that project as a sequence, right? So you could tell the story of that project. Well, first of all, we had, the researchers said we had a referral to talk with someone, and we tested out that opportunity with our developers. We got back a validation from them. Here's a new strategic capability. We took that proposal here, so you can actually tell the story of the network. And from a business perspective, basically what you're doing, for those of you who know process, if this was spaghetti and meatballs, you pull out your string of spaghetti and you have the flow, the process, but all of your intangibles are embedded in it. I actually like to use the term activity instead of process. And the reason is why. Very simply, if you close your eyes and I use the word process, what images come to your mind? Probably a piece of paper and a drawing. If I use the term business activity, you see people. You see people engaged in their work together. And so you can scope what you look at around what might used to be called a process. Basically, we scope this around the innovation to market process. But it's not linear. We're accessing that whole brain pattern sensing intelligence to understand how can we improve the whole system. If you're focused on one process in a linear way, you cannot see the ecosystem. We're trying to create a healthy, robust ecosystem that can handle anything you throw at it. So, for example, Boeing is one of our most enthusiastic customers. They had a challenge of moving from testing 1 or 2 airplanes a day to 4 to 6. Now you think of a 787 coming into your plant in the morning, and you have to take that extremely complicated piece of equipment through all of its safety checks, maintenance, documentation, paperwork, and get it out the door by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Just doing one is is enormous, and they had an organization of about 3,200 people testing 1 or 2 a day. Now they've mandated to go to 4 to 6. You can't just do what you're doing 5 or 6 times faster. And further, no 2 airplanes are alike. The goal of a process view is to drive out variation, to define the perfect process that everything's going to follow. But in many complicated situations, and including development, variation is a given. No 2 situations are ever exactly alike. Even here, one airplane would have a wing damage and need more maintenance. Another one takes the happy path, nothing wrong, just flies right through. Another one has missing paperwork. Maybe another is an old model and the parts aren't available. So what they did was they modeled the entire activity as a value network, and then they continually run scenarios to test it out. How is it going to move through our organization if we have this situation? How is it going to move in this situation? And you walk in their conference room, and they have a system dynamic map, which we integrated with the value network model and their key business processes as visuals on the wall. Very, very different way to orient. They resource that organization by roles. When they have the daily roster of who's going to work on what, they have the role, the employee identifier, who's going to play it that day, their name, and oh, by the way, what organization did they come from? So if they're shorthanded, they could pull people from anywhere to resource those critical roles. You might have a role that isn't even needed for 3 days, but the next day, if you don't have 2 people in that role, by 2 o'clock this afternoon, you're not going to get your airplanes out. So it's a radically different way of thinking about how you resource the work, how those roles get played. I always like to say the role doesn't care who plays it. In organizations, we care a lot about who sits in those boxes on the org chart. But when you look at the work itself, the role doesn't care. What's important are the exchanges between the roles, and it's a very different way to come at it. So how do we link this to intellectual capital? Very simple. Remember that model of we have inputs and outputs? We look at our inputs, every single one, and ask, how is this input helping us to realize financial improvement, grow our human competence, improve our internal structures and systems, or social capital? Same thing on the output side, and you can use other models. We use the Carl Eriksveby model as a default because it's one of the simplest, but I'll share with you how we've used others. On the output side, the same thing, but here it's an asset utilization question. How well are we utilizing our financial and non-financial assets to create value for others? So how well are we utilizing our assets to their full capacity? And this is also where we ask the impact question. What is the impact of creating this value output in terms of our industry, our society, and our environment? Cost benefit. Are we really contributing value in a large sense, or is the cost of producing this too high in some factor? But we also, from the very beginning, have had that sustainability question since I put this together in 1997. So what we have is a way to model the work. This animation actually is from our application, where you can begin to understand the very specific knowledge exchanges between the roles from both the tangible side and the intangible side. So to share with you just a couple of the projects that we've been involved in, I'm just picking and choosing sort of the larger scale ones today. We looked at the global finance system. It was a project funded by the Ford Foundation. We worked with iScale. You have that, Ford is a funder as well. In 2007, We worked on the project effectiveness of ICT RTD impacts on the EU innovation system. I'm going to go into that one in a little depth. What I'm not going to discuss in depth today is regional development Sweden, but if you go on our website, valuenetworks.com, and search innovation, there's a whole bunch of blogs, and there's a link to this in one of those. There's things on, I think you can put in a search term, regional innovation. I'm sorry? I'm what? Ford, I'm not sure. We subcontracted to iScale, and they had the funding from Ford. I worked with Steve Waddell, who's looked at global action networks. He has a really lovely blog called Networking Action, and he's a very dear friend. We've worked on several projects together. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about this project. We were able, in the course of this project, to link value network patterns to intellectual capital formation and macroeconomic analysis at the regional level, and also at the organizational and interorganizational levels. So we looked at the macro level intellectual capital formation at the regional level, and then organizationally and interorganizationally we used the same analysis. The goal was to understand effectiveness of collaboration networks, looking at things like knowledge flows, how the links between the funding EU framework program and diffusion of innovation could be strengthened, targeting how to strengthen the leverage of their funding initiatives into innovation. We addressed innovation in their broadest sense as the interplay of institutional research and market innovation actors. So that was how we were defining an innovation system. These are some of our assessment questions, trying to understand how the funding reinforced the innovation systems, how the programs could better be used as tools for growth and as ways to structure, what tacit knowledge, skills, and capabilities are acquired through these projects, what policy changes could be made, and what opportunities exist to improve the impact. I actually was involved in a similar evaluation effort there in 2005 before we had our technology.